It all started, as most suburban horror stories do, with a piece of paper. Not just any paper, mind you. This was a specific, weaponized grade of stationery, a shade of lavender so cloying it made my teeth ache. For most normal people, a lavender envelope might signal a wedding invitation, or perhaps a baby shower announcement for a distant cousin. It might bring a flutter of pleasant anticipation. In Serenity Meadows, it was a declaration of war. I held the envelope up to the light of my home office window, the pale purple glowing ominously. The words "Final Notice" were printed in a stern, unforgiving font, positioned just above our family name. My name. Frank Miller. A name that, for the last 6 months, had become synonymous with neighborhood scofflaw in the eyes of one Brenda Jean. For most people, I muttered to the empty room, my voice a low grumble that wouldn't disturb the actual subterranean harmony of the neighborhood. A lavender envelope is a good thing. For me, it meant Brenda Jean was on the warpath again. And this time it felt final. My wife, Sarah, had warned me. When we first saw the house, a lovely 2-story colonial with a big, sloping backyard just begging for a pool, she'd pointed out the pristine, almost unnaturally perfect lawns of the surrounding homes. "This is an HOA neighborhood, Frank," she'd said, her tone a gentle caution. "A serious one. Are you sure you can behave?" I'd scoffed. Behave? I'm the most boringly behaved man in America. I sort my recycling. I return my shopping cart. I don't play loud music. What could possibly go wrong? Famous last words. What went wrong was Brenda Jean, HOA president, reigning monarch of Serenity Meadows, and a woman who seemed to derive her very life force from the misery of others. This particular lavender-scented harbinger of doom was about the pool. My pool. The one I was planning to build in my own backyard. I own a business, Aqua Lux Pools. I install and maintain high-end swimming pools for a living. It was, to put it mildly, my area of expertise. Building one for my own family felt like the culmination of a lifelong dream. For my kids, it was the promise of endless summer fun. For Brenda, it was an act of aggression. I tore the envelope open, my thumb catching on the thick, expensive paper. The violation, according to the meticulously typed notice, was unauthorized soil displacement and potential disruption to subterranean neighborhood harmony. I read the phrase out loud twice. Subterranean neighborhood harmony. It sounded like something a cult leader would say right before handing you a cup of Kool-Aid. What did it even mean? Was she worried we'd upset the gophers? That the rhythmic plunging of a shovel would throw the earth off its axis? No, it was simpler than that. Subterranean neighborhood harmony was a euphemism for Brenda doesn't like the noise. This wasn't our first rodeo, of course, not by a long shot. Our 6 months in this suburban paradise had been a masterclass in petty tyranny, a slow drip of infractions that had eroded my will to live. It had started small, as these things always do. A month after we moved in, the first lavender envelope arrived. The mailbox incident. Our mailbox, a perfectly functional and inoffensive box, was painted forest green, a lovely shade. But the Serenity Meadows bylaws, a document thicker than the phone book for a medium-sized city, clearly stated on page 47, sub-article G, paragraph 3, that all mailboxes must be hunter green. I spent a weekend staring at paint swatches at Home Depot, trying to discern the microscopic difference between the two. Hun? Are we really going to war over 2 slightly different shades of green? I'd asked Sarah, holding up 2 nearly identical cards. She'd sighed, placing a comforting hand on my arm. We aren't, Frank. Brenda is, and she's got the paint swatches to prove it. I'd bought the hunter green. Then came the truck incident. I drive a Ram 3500 for work. It's my mobile office, my hauler of equipment, the backbone of my business. It's also clean, new, and sports the tasteful Aqualux Pools logo on the doors. One Tuesday, I parked it on the street in front of my own house for approximately 45 minutes while I unloaded a week's worth of groceries. By the time I came back out, a lavender notice was tucked under my windshield wiper, citing me for operating a commercial enterprise in a residential view corridor. Apparently, the very sight of my truck was enough to tank property values for a 3-block radius. But the one that truly broke my spirit was the Garden Gnome Massacre. My 2 kids, 8-year-old Lily and 6-year-old Sam, had a beloved garden gnome they'd named Norman. He was a cheerful little fellow with a pointy red hat and a fishing rod. He sat amongst my wife's petunias, a silent ceramic guardian of our little patch of suburbia. Norman was cited for being non-conforming lawn ornamentation. The notice, dripping with passive aggression, helpfully suggested that Norman be relocated to a more suitable, non-visible location. I tried to explain to my kids that Norman had to go into witness protection. They cried for an hour. I hid him in the garage, behind the lawnmower, where he stares at me with accusatory porcelain eyes every time I go to get a tool. So the pool was just the latest and greatest battle in my ongoing, unwinnable war. I crumpled the notice in my fist and looked out at my backyard. It was a blank canvas of green grass. Soon, it would be a hole. And then a paradise. I wasn't going to let some power-crazed tyrant with a penchant for purple paper stand in my way. The next morning, the first shot was fired. Not by me, but by the arrival of Dave. Dave is my lead contractor, a man built like a refrigerator with a walrus mustache that seemed to contain its own gravitational pull. He's a salt-of-the-earth guy who has forgotten more about construction than I'll ever know. He's seen 100 HOAs and has the same level of respect for them as he does for a swarm of mosquitoes. His diesel truck rumbled to a stop at the curb, and as if summoned by the sound, Brenda materialized on her front porch across the street. She moved with a preternatural speed, a blur of beige cardigan and sensible shoes. She crossed the street, her 3-ring binder of bylaws clutched to her chest like a holy text. "Frank," she said, her voice managing to be both sweet and sharp, like poisoned honey, "I see the excavation is commencing." I leaned against my hunter green mailbox, forcing a smile. "Morning, Brenda. We're just marking the ground, with tiny flags, very non-disruptive. They barely displace any soil at all." She ignored me, turning her laser-like focus on Dave, who was busy unloading a surveying wheel. "I'll need to see your permit," she announced. "Your insurance bond, a list of all subcontractors, and a projected timeline of noise-making activities, as per Section 12, Sub-Article C of the Community Guidelines." Dave stopped and looked at her, his expression utterly blank. He slowly wiped a hand across his mustache. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low baritone that could calm a wild animal or start a bar fight with equal ease. "I've got a permit from the city of Austin. That's the one that keeps me out of jail. You want a copy?" Brenda's nostrils flared. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible movement, but I'd come to recognize it as a sign of extreme displeasure. "The city's rules," she said, her voice dripping with condescension, "are merely a suggestion. The HOA's rules are binding." Dave just stared at her for a long moment before turning back to his truck. He rolled his eyes and shared a look with me that communicated a novel's worth of information. It said, "Don't worry, boss. I've dealt with her kind before. We've got a live one." Brenda stood there for another minute, as if expecting us to fall to our knees and beg for her forgiveness. When we didn't, she sniffed, turned on her heel, and marched back to her fortress of solitude, the binder held high. The battle lines had been drawn. My alliance with Dave was forged. The first shovel, or rather the first scoop of the mini-excavator, broke ground the following day. The machine, small as excavators go, was still a magnificent beast of yellow steel and hydraulic power. My kids, Lily and Sam, stood at the back window, their faces pressed against the glass, squealing with delight every time the bucket plunged into the earth and came up with a load of dirt. Sarah was cautiously optimistic, humming to herself as she made lemonade in the kitchen. The piece lasted exactly 57 minutes. That's when Brenda, having exhausted her direct confrontation tactics, moved on to guerrilla warfare. She called the city compliance office. I knew because a white city-owned sedan pulled up an hour later, and a tired-looking man in a polo shirt got out, a decibel meter in his hand. Brenda was waiting for him on her porch, pointing an accusatory finger toward my backyard. The officer trudged over, listened for a few minutes while Dave's crew worked, glanced at his meter, and shook his head. He walked over to my fence. "Frank Miller?" he asked. "That's me," I said. "Your crew is at 85 decibels, he said, showing me the meter. "Legal limit for daytime construction is 95. You're well within your rights. Have a nice day." He didn't even try to hide his annoyance. He shot a weary look at Brenda's house, got back in his car, and drove away. Through her window, I could see Brenda, phone in hand, taking pictures of the hole in my yard. She was documenting evidence for a war crime that hadn't been committed. That evening, Sarah and I sat on the back patio, watching the sun set over the growing mound of dirt that would soon be our suburban oasis. "She's not going to let this go, is she?" Sarah asked, her voice quiet. I took a long sip of my beer. "Nope. This isn't about the pool anymore. It was never about the gnome or the mailbox. It's about the fact that we're doing something she can't control. This is her personal Vietnam, and my backyard is the jungle. Just try not to engage, okay?" she pleaded. "Don't sink to her level." I looked at the giant hole in my yard. My level is currently 6 feet under, where the deep end will be. Technically, she'd have to sink up to my level. Sarah just sighed and rested her head on my shoulder. The first day of construction was over. We had survived. But I knew with a certainty that chilled my soul that this was only the beginning. Brenda Jean was just getting warmed up. The next few days settled into a tense routine. Dave and his crew would arrive at 8 a.m. sharp. At 8:05, Brenda would appear, either watching from her porch with binoculars like a Cold War spy, or pacing the sidewalk, taking notes on a little pad. The digging continued, the hole getting deeper and more wonderfully pool-shaped. My kids were in heaven, convinced we were digging for dinosaur bones. I was in a state of high alert, waiting for the other shoe to drop. And then, on a bright Wednesday morning, it dropped, with the force of a concrete anvil. I was in my office, on the phone with a supplier, when I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. A landscaping truck, not one I recognized, had pulled up in front of Brenda's house. 2 burly men got out and started unloading something heavy from the back. I squinted, trying to see what it was. It looked like a large, concrete thing. My view was partially obscured by the magnificent oak tree that stood on the easement between our 2 properties. Right next to the oak tree, squat, red, and immovably solid, was the neighborhood fire hydrant. It wasn't pretty, but it was one of those vital, invisible pieces of civic infrastructure you don't think about until you desperately need it. It sat there, a silent sentinel, ready to save our homes from fiery oblivion. I watched, a knot of dread tightening in my stomach, as the 2 landscapers wrestled the concrete object into place. They set it down with a heavy thud, directly in front of the fire hydrant. It was a massive, 3-tiered concrete planter, the kind of ostentatious lawn ornament you see in front of a bad Italian restaurant. It was heavy, it was ugly, and it was filled with a garish, tasteless mix of marigolds and petunias. Most importantly, it made accessing the fire hydrant completely and utterly impossible. I hung up the phone mid-sentence. There are lines, Unspoken rules that govern a civilized society. You don't mess with the IRS, you don't tug on Superman's cape, and you absolutely, under no circumstances, block a fire hydrant. It's not just an HOA violation, it's a fundamental breach of the social contract. It's a middle finger to public safety. But Brenda's contract, I was beginning to realize, was only with herself. I took a deep breath, straightened my shirt, and walked outside. The advice from Sarah, "Don't engage," was a faint whisper in the back of my mind, drowned out by a roaring chorus of, "Are you kidding me?" I crossed the street, my feet moving with a purpose I hadn't felt in months. Brenda was already there, directing the landscapers, pointing and gesturing as they packed soil around the base of the planter. She was in her element, a general commanding her troops. She was wearing gardening gloves and a wide-brimmed sun hat, the very picture of suburban bliss. "Brenda," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "Hey." She didn't look up from her work. "Frank," she replied, her tone breezy. "That's a substantial planter you've got there," I said, trying to keep the sarcasm from dripping out of every word. "It's a neighborhood beautification effort," she said, snipping a dead leaf from a petunia. "That rusted piece of metal was an eyesore. It was bringing down property values." I stared at her, dumbfounded. "The fire hydrant? Brenda, that's not an eyesore. It's emergency equipment. You can't block it." "I've consulted the bylaws," she said, her voice smug. "There's no specific rule against decorative floral arrangements. However," she paused for dramatic effect, "there is a rule against unseemly public utilities. I'm improving our community." The sheer, unmitigated audacity of it was breathtaking. She had twisted the rules into a pretzel of self-serving logic. "This isn't a community issue, it's a safety issue," I insisted, my voice rising. "A fire department truck needs at least 3 feet of clearance around a hydrant. You have -6 inches. You need to move it." She finally straightened up and looked at me, a thin, pitying smile on her face. "I'm afraid that's not possible, Frank. It's far too heavy. The men have already left. And besides," she gestured to the flowers, "it's already planted. Have a serene day." She turned her back to me and went back to admiring her handiwork. I stood there, rooted to the spot, my hands clenched into fists. I could feel the blood pounding in my ears. I walked back to my house, the sound of a challenge ringing louder than any alarm bell. The point of no return had been reached. I stormed into the house, grabbed my phone, and paced my living room like a caged tiger. My first instinct was to call Dave and his crew and have them move the planter with the excavator. But that was exactly what she wanted. An escalation. A clear violation I could be fined for. No, I had to do this by the book. Her book. I called the city's non-emergency police line. I explained the situation to the dispatcher as calmly and rationally as I could, trying to sound like a concerned citizen and not a man on the verge of a suburban rage-induced aneurysm. "My neighbor has completely blocked a fire hydrant with a large concrete planter." I gave them the address and waited. An hour later, a patrol car rolled up. A single officer got out. He looked to be in his 50s, with a face that was etched with the kind of deep, weary lines that only come from decades of dealing with other people's problems. His name tag read Miller, the same last name as mine. I took it as a good omen. He ambled over to where I was standing in my driveway. His eyes fell on the planter, and he let out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be," he said, a hint of amusement in his voice. "You weren't kidding." "Can you make her move it?" I asked, feeling a surge of hope. "It's a public safety hazard. It's illegal." Officer Miller sighed, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of the world. "Let me go talk to her." He walked over to Brenda's front door and knocked. I couldn't hear the conversation, but I could see Brenda through the screen door, gesturing animatedly, probably quoting her sacred bylaws. After a few minutes, Miller walked back. His shoulders slumped in defeat. "Okay," he said, rubbing his temples. "So, here's the deal. She's claiming it's a temporary decorative installation. And because there's no active fire, technically she's right. I can't force her to move it. It's a code enforcement issue, not a police matter. And the fire marshal himself would have to come down here and declare it an immediate obstruction." My hope deflated like a cheap pool toy. "So I have to wait for my house to be on fire for someone to do something?" I asked, my voice laced with disbelief. Officer Miller took a step closer and lowered his voice. "Look," he said, a note of sympathy in his tone. "Between you and me, the woman's a menace. We get calls to this street twice a month, and they all have her name on them. Mailboxes, lawn gnomes, you name it. But my hands are tied. It's a civil issue. The fire department is your best bet, but they're not going to roll a truck for a potential problem. They've got actual emergencies to deal with." He paused, looking from the planter back to me. "My advice? Document everything. Take pictures. And maybe—" He leaned in even closer, a twinkle in his eye. "Get creative." He gave me a small, conspiratorial nod, clapped me on the shoulder, and walked back to his patrol car. As he drove away, his words echoed in my head. Get creative. I stood there in my driveway, the gears in my brain grinding, then slowly, wonderfully beginning to turn. I looked at the offensive concrete planter, a monument to petty tyranny. I looked at Brenda's perfectly manicured, award-winning Kentucky bluegrass lawn. Then, my eyes drifted over to the other side of my driveway, and I smiled. Parked there, gleaming in the afternoon sun, was my beautiful, magnificent Ram 3500. And hitched to the back of it was the crown jewel of my business, a 5,000-gallon water tanker. It was full to the brim, prepped and ready for a big pool-filling job across town the next morning. 5,000 gallons of clean, cool, life-giving water. A slow, mischievous, and utterly glorious grin spread across my face. Sarah had told me not to sink to Brenda's level. Officer Miller had told me to get creative. I decided to do both. 2 minutes. That's all it took for my rage to crystallize into a plan of beautiful, malicious compliance. 2 minutes after Officer Miller's patrol car disappeared around the corner, I was climbing into the cab of my truck. The diesel engine of the Ram rumbled to life with a satisfying roar. There's a feeling of power that comes with commanding a machine that large, a feeling I usually associate with a hard day's work. But today, it felt different. Today, it felt like I was climbing into the cockpit of a fighter jet or the command seat of a tank. Today, this truck wasn't just a tool of my trade, it was an instrument of justice. My internal monologue was humming. They say you should never attribute to malice what can be adequately explained by stupidity. But Brenda had achieved a perfect synthesis of both. And my tanker, all 5,000 gallons of it, was the only adequate response. This wasn't malice. This was education, a practical hands-on lesson in civic responsibility. I put the truck in gear. I didn't back out onto the street and head towards the job site. Instead, I pulled forward, swinging the big rig in a wide, deliberate arc. I maneuvered it until the tanker was parked perfectly parallel to the curb, directly in front of Brenda's house. The main outflow valve, a formidable-looking piece of industrial steel, was aimed squarely at her property. A silver cannon pointed at a kingdom of beige. The effect was immediate. Curtains twitched in the houses up and down the street. It was like a prairie dog town sensing a predator. Heads popped up over fences. In my backyard, Dave and his crew stopped working. They leaned on their shovels, a silent, captivated audience. And then the final piece fell into place. Brenda's front door flew open, and she stormed out onto her porch, her face a mask of incandescent rage. "What do you think you're doing?" she shrieked, her voice cracking with fury. "You can't park that monstrosity there. That's a commercial vehicle." I killed the engine, letting the sudden silence amplify the tension. I leaned out the window, composing my face into an expression of beatific calm and exaggerated cheerfulness. "Morning, Brenda," I called out, my voice booming in the quiet street. "Just being a proactive member of the community." She stared at me, her mouth hanging open, utterly confused. "Officer Miller pointed out that our fire hydrant is obstructed," I continued, projecting for the whole neighborhood to hear. "Well, I can't have that. The safety of Serenity Meadows is my top priority. Yours too, I imagine." "What are you talking about?" she stammered. "My tanker," I announced, gesturing grandly to the giant silver cylinder behind me. "It's full of water, 5,000 gallons to be exact. I'm staging it here as a temporary mobile fire suppression resource. You know, in case of an emergency, just until the hydrant is accessible again, better safe than sorry." The logic was so absurd, so beautifully twisted, that it left her speechless. She just stood there, sputtering, as Dave the contractor ambled over from my yard, a huge grin splitting his mustache. "Boss," he said, keeping his voice low but unable to hide his glee. "That's the smartest damn thing I've ever seen." "Just doing my civic duty, Dave," I said with a solemn nod. "You need help preparing the, suppression area?" he asked, winking so hard I thought his eyelid might cramp. "That won't be necessary," I replied, my heart singing. "But I appreciate the support." I hopped down from the truck's cab, my boots hitting the asphalt with a satisfying thud. I walked calmly and deliberately to the back of the tanker, to the main valve. Brenda had recovered enough to find her phone and was now holding it up, recording me, her hand shaking with rage. "Now, I do have a job to get to," I called out to her, my voice full of reasonable explanation. "So I need to empty this tank to get it ready for tomorrow's client. I figure the best place to offload this emergency water is right here, near the hydrant, where it'll do the most good. Don't want it just sitting in the truck, right? It might get stale." The color drained from her face. "You wouldn't dare!" she screeched. "That's my lawn. That's award-winning Kentucky bluegrass. I won a regional award." I gave her my most sincere, helpful smile. "Think of it as preemptive irrigation, Brenda. You're welcome." And with a smooth, practiced motion, I turned the valve. It wasn't a violent fire hose blast. It was something far more insidious. A thick, steady, relentless torrent of water, a silver python uncoiling from the tank. It gushed out onto the asphalt, a miniature waterfall in the middle of our quiet, suburban street. It hit the curb, and, obeying the laws of physics that Brenda's bylaws could not override, it spilled over. The water found its level, and that level was Brenda's front yard. I stood back, my arms crossed, and watched the show. The sound was glorious, a deep, satisfying glug-glug-glug as 5,000 gallons of liquid karma sought their destiny. The first casualties were the garish marigolds in the planter. They were uprooted in seconds, their bright orange heads bobbing away in the newly formed river that was once her sidewalk. The award-winning Kentucky bluegrass, so perfectly green and manicured, vanished under a rapidly growing crystal-clear pond. Brenda was on her phone, screaming into it. "He's flooding me! He's flooding my property! Vandalism! Destruction of property! Send the police! Send the army!" Her pleas were answered, though not in the way she'd hoped. The familiar white patrol car, the same one from an hour ago, came rolling down the street. Officer Miller parked, got out, and took in the scene. He looked at me standing calmly by my truck. He looked at Brenda, shrieking on her porch as if she were watching the Titanic sink. He looked at her front yard, which now resembled a rice paddy. He slowly brought a hand to his face and pinched the bridge of his nose, but he couldn't quite hide the smile that was playing on his lips. He walked over to me, his stride unhurried. "Let me guess," he said, his voice dry. "You're providing a public service?" "Just making sure the neighborhood is safe, officer," I said solemnly. "And emptying my tank for work tomorrow. Figured I could do both at once. 2 birds, 1 stone." He nodded, as if this were the most reasonable explanation in the world. He then turned his attention to the porch. "Ma'am," he called out to Brenda, "is he spraying your house? Is any of that water hitting your physical residence?" "No!" she shrieked back. "He's ruining my lawn!" Miller cupped a hand to his ear. "He's watering your lawn, you say?" "Ma'am, that's water, on grass. That's not vandalism. He's parked legally on a public street, and the water is being discharged onto the public easement, from which it is flowing onto your property due to gravity. There's no crime here." But, Brenda stammered, her brain finally short-circuiting from the sheer, unassailable logic of the situation. "My bluegrass." Officer Miller gave a theatrical sigh. "You know," he called out, his voice carrying a note of profound wisdom, "all of this could probably stop if you just found a way to move that planter." Checkmate. He gave her a moment to process this. Then he shrugged, gave me another one of his almost imperceptible nods, and got back into his car. He drove away, leaving Brenda standing speechless in her doorway, a defeated general on the steps of her flooded capital, as the last of the 5,000 gallons turned her award-winning lawn into a miniature wetland. The next morning, the neighborhood was transformed. The water had mostly soaked in, leaving behind a soggy, muddy testament to the previous day's events. Brenda's lawn was a swamp. The offensive concrete planter sat in the middle of the quagmire like a sad, forgotten island, its garish flowers drooping in defeat. The story, however, had not soaked in. It had spread like wildfire. As I was outside talking to Dave, who was still chuckling to himself, my neighbors started to emerge. Not with angry glares, but with shy smiles and nods of respect. Mr. Henderson, a retired gentleman from 3 houses down, walked over, leaning on his cane. "I saw the whole thing from my window, son," he said, his voice raspy with age and delight. "It was beautiful, like watching the Berlin Wall come down, but with more petunias." He then proceeded to tell me how Brenda had fined him $50 for having a basketball hoop that was, according to her, aesthetically displeasing. Soon, others joined. The family across the street, the Garcias, came over. Mrs. Garcia told me they'd been fined because their kid's new swing set was made of unapproved cedar instead of the sanctioned redwood stipulated in the bylaws. Another neighbor had been cited for holiday lights that were excessively cheerful. It turned out I wasn't the only one living under the thumb of a petty tyrant. I had just been the first one with access to a 5,000-gallon water tanker. I had become, in the space of an afternoon, an unlikely suburban folk hero. That weekend, an email went out. An emergency HOA meeting had been called. For the first time, it wasn't called by Brenda. The community center meeting room, usually sparsely attended, was packed. I went, taking a seat quietly in the back with Sarah. The main agenda item was a motion of no confidence in Brenda Jean's leadership. When the vote was called, it was a sea of raised hands. Brenda stood up, her face pale, and tried to argue, quoting bylaws and procedures. But her power was gone. Her authority was built on a foundation of intimidation and meticulously weaponized rules. My flood had washed it all away. She resigned in disgrace, grabbing her 3-ring binder and stalking out of the room to a smattering of applause. The first official act of the new, reasonable HOA president, a friendly IT manager named Mark, was to hire a professional crew to remove the concrete planter. They had to use a small crane. A month later, my backyard was no longer a hole, but a paradise. The pool was finished, the water a sparkling, crystalline blue that reflected the clear Texas sky. The smell of chlorine and sunscreen filled the air. I was hosting a celebratory BBQ for the whole neighborhood. My kids were splashing and laughing in the deep end. Dave and his crew were there, enjoying well-deserved beers and burgers. The sound was one of pure, unadulterated joy. It was the picture of suburban peace I had always wanted. I stood by the grill, a spatula in my hand, and looked over the fence toward Brenda's house. A landscaping company was there, laying down fresh, new sod on her formerly swamped lawn. A fresh start. She wasn't outside. I hadn't seen much of her since the meeting, and I didn't feel a sense of triumph or revenge. Just a quiet, profound satisfaction. A sense of balance restored. Sarah came up behind me and wrapped her arms around my waist. "You know," she said softly into my ear, "I told you not to sink to her level." I flipped a burger, a smile playing on my lips. "And I didn't," I said. "I brought her up to mine. All it took was a little pressure, and 5,000 gallons of water."